this next query, we're going to be applying a number of different aggregate functions. So this is really an exercise in understanding different aggregate functions in Tableau. We're going to be working with sales data. So I'm going to go ahead and use tr subtotal here. So I'm going to be adding tr subtotal a number of times. And because this is both, of course, purchases and sales, I'm going to be filtering out so we only use sales. So I'm going to say tr trans type to filters, and I'm going to say sales orders, say OK. And then I want this in different sites, so I'm going to do tr site code. And actually I want this in 2015 only, so I'm going to need to add a filter. So this now shows me for each site. So for California, what was the sum of sales in California for entire 2015? What was the sum of sales in Florida? And so on. The next one was I wanted average sales per transaction. So I'm going to go ahead and say average here instead. And what this now is showing is looking at all individual transactions that were made in 2015. And for California, I'm saying what was the average sales amount for those transactions. So say I have 10 different transactions in 2015. Of course, I have thousands and thousands. But say I have 10 transactions in California in 2015. This average is going to take the average of those 10 transactions subtotals and display that. So in California, the average was 22,728 was the average value of each sales transaction. And the next one is going to say number of sales transactions. So here I'm simply going to do count. So in California, I had 7,609 sales transactions in 2015. So I'm simply counting how many rows meet these criteria. And each row that meet this criteria is a sales transaction. And then it counts for each entity or each site, how many transactions there are. Count will not count anything with null values. So if I select a field here that does have some null values in the column, then those will be skipped. So just be careful with the specific field you're selecting. But if the field has values in all relevant rows, then it doesn't matter which field you're counting. We're also going to figure out the total quantity sold based on TR quantity, average unit price per transaction, and a few other things. But we're going to be using TR quantity next. So here, if I'm summing up TR quantity, I'm summing up all the different transaction quantities. So again, if I have 10 transactions in California, each one of those transactions is going to have a certain number of quantities sold. So say they have 100, 200, 300, 100, 200, 300, 100, 200, 300, and 200 quantities sold for each one of these transactions. Then the sum will be 2,000 for those 10 transactions. Okay, so the next thing then is we're going to say average unit price per transaction. So here I'm going to drag unit price, and then I'm simply going to change this to average. So this now is telling me across those 10 transactions I had in California, each one of those transactions is going to have a different unit price. What is the average of those 10 unit prices? In the next one, I'm going to calculate the average unit price per item sold. Notice that these transactions actually have a different number of units sold, but I'm not taking the quantity sold into consideration when I calculate this average. I'm simply taking the average of the unit price of those 10 transactions. So if I, for example, had 10 transactions and 9 of those transactions only had 1 unit sold and the other one had 10,000 units sold, and if I'm just simply taking an average, then I'm not weighting those transactions differently. But say I want to find out the average price of the actual units sold, given how many we sold, then I would need to weight the one transaction with a higher quantity more heavily. And to do this, I need to actually do a different type of calculation where I need to sum the subtotals up and then divide that by the quantity itself. So here I'm going to start with TR subtotal, and then I'm going to double click here, and I'm going to simply say divided by sum, open parenthesis, and then TR quantity. I'm going to do end parenthesis. So the formula is I'm going to sum transaction subtotal. So now I'm getting the sum of all the transactions, the value of those transactions, the dollar value, and then I divided it by the sum of the quantities of all those transactions. And now I'm getting a weighted average value or unit price per item sold. And Tableau adds this ag in front of it, saying it's an aggregate function. So I'm going to first aggregate this sum, and then I'm going to aggregate the sum of the quantity, and then I'm going to divide those after I have aggregated those two separately. The next thing we're going to calculate is the number of customers. So I'm going to be using entity ID or any other field that uniquely identifies each customer. So I'm going to take entity ID here. And then for entity ID, I need to change this to do a count. And if I simply count, now I'm again counting the number of transactions within each side. And I don't want to do that. I actually want to count how many customers I have in total. So if a customer appears in many transactions, I don't want to keep counting those customers multiple times. So what I need to do is I need to apply a count distinct function. And then I'm going to move that all the way to the right. So if we go to the bottom here now, what I'm seeing here is how many customers do I have in each site. So I have 148 customers in California. If I change this to count, notice now I have something like 7,600, which is the same as up here when I counted the number of transactions. And then finally, we want to find out the average sales per customer, which is simply an aggregate calculation again, where we're going to sum up total sales and then divide that by the count distinct of different entity IDs. I'm going to copy this, I'm going to highlight that and say Control C, and then I'm going to take TR subtotal again, and then that's automatically getting summed. So then I want to divide that sum by this count D, and I'm going to show you what that looks like again. So I'm simply summing all the transaction subtotals, which we have filtered out, so we only have sales. So this is the sum of all sales subtotals, and then I divide out by the number of customers. And since I'm grouping based on the different entities, and I'm filtering for 2015, I'm getting the total sum of sales in 2015 for each site, and then dividing that by the number of customers in each site in 2015. And now I'm getting the average sales per customer.